Our third paper, is co-authored by Patrice Dutil and David Mckenzie from Ryerson University. I understand it's just Patrice who's going to be presenting. Patrice Dutil is a professor at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson. He has published 9 books and dozens of scholarly articles on various aspects of the Canadian political tradition and public administration. He was the founder of the Literary Review of Canada and recently ended an 8-year term as president of the Champlain Society. His most recent book is Prime Ministerial Power in Canada, Its Origins under Macdonald, Laurier, and Borden, from the UBC Press. David Mckenzie is a professor in the Department of History at Ryerson. His main areas of academic interest are Canadian history and international relations and the study of international organizations, and he is the author of numerous books in these areas. Their paper, as you can see, is entitled The Road to Reciprocity, 1911. This paper addresses the circumstances that prompted the American government in 1910 to offer Canada an opportunity to discuss a new reciprocity trade agreement. This paper examines the evolution of Canadian tariff policy and analyzes the evolution of Canada's trade with the United States in the early 20th century. The paper also examines the state of the Canadian and American economies, the negotiation process, and the contents of the final agreement, and what it could have meant for both economies if it had been ratified. Patrice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't stand well behind podiums, so if you don't mind, I'm not going to pace, but I'll try not to fall off. Before I start my paper, I want to send David Mckenzie's apologies. At Ryerson, we teach in 3-hour blocks, and it just so happens that one of his blocks is Thursday morning from 9 to 12. And since we want to do things chronologically in this conference, well, 1911 happens first, and David has kindly allowed me to present on his behalf. The second thing I'd like to say is to acknowledge Joe Martin's leadership again in the teaching of business history. I'm very happy to say that Ryerson has joined the ranks of MBA programs that teach business history. I had the privilege of teaching for the first time the Canadian Business History course at Ryerson this summer. It's an optional MBA course, and it'll be offered again next summer. It went well, and Ryerson now becomes, the 3rd or 4th MBA school that teaches Canadian business history. So I'm very happy to acknowledge that. 1911 is important for 2 reasons. The first one, and it's important for us today because it is an exceptional moment. It is the only time the Americans extended an offer to Canada. It's the only time, a formal offer. We could argue about 1948. I'm happy to argue about that, but it was never a formal offer. 1948 was a sort of a under-the-table footsie between Truman and King and their subordinates. It never really came to anything. 1911 was a formal offer, and it was, as I say, the only time the Americans formally offered Canada a deal, a free trade deal. That's why it's important. Their circumstances behind that make it important and make it relevant to us today. What we want to do in this paper is look at why did this opportunity arise? Why 1910? Why 1911? Why did this happen at that time? Why not some other time? And we have a thesis. We're offering a different kind of thesis. It's never really been studied before. We're looking at the reasons why the Americans effected this rapprochement with Canada in the late aught years of the 20th century. And there are 3 reasons. I'll get into that. I'll unpack it over the next 15 minutes. The first one was President Taft himself. His character, his approach to policy, and his knowledge of Canada. Not a trivial thing. Howard Taft summered at what was then called Murray's Bay. It's called La Malbaie now in Quebec. That's an important factor. President Taft knew Canada. The second one was the economic ambitions of the United States at a very particular time. The third one was a willingness to deal with Canada that went beyond the presidency. And I'll talk about the secretaries of state, people who are not particularly well known or pretty well forgotten, certainly by Canada, less so, of course, in the United States. And finally, the opportunity in Ottawa that presented itself. I'm not going to repeat Joe's lecture, nor Stefano's. Broad milestones, important milestones in the relationship between Canada and the United States. Lord Elgin in 1854, as you've pointed out, very important. We don't know enough about Lord Elgin. This is a commercial announcement for those people who are looking for a research topic. We do not know enough about Lord Elgin. The biography we have of Lord Elgin goes back to 1906. This man was pivotal in the governance of this country and in the trade arrangements of this country. Really a 21st century Canadian stuck in the mid-19th century. The abrogation of the FTA, Free Trade Agreement, in 1866, it's been covered. Alexander Mckenzie, the Prime Minister, commissioned George Brown to negotiate a deal, to try to negotiate a deal in the mid-1870s. It didn't work out. The national policy, Joe's covered it already. Laurier himself, a committed free trader from the very beginning, campaigned on that platform in 1891, was soundly defeated by Sir John A. Laurier came back, elected to power finally in 1896, and with his Minister of Finance, William Fielding, established a three-tier tariff policy. Very sophisticated tariff policy. A preferential treatment with Britain that eventually amounted to a discount on British products, a middle tariff that was negotiated with France, and then a regular tariff for any other country. Very sophisticated approach by Laurier and his minister Fielding that is well worth remembering. At the same time, you've got the Americans, again, Joe's mentioned it, the McKinley tariff McKinley becomes president in 1896, a few months after Laurier brings in more protective tariffs. That was a situation the Americans and the Canadians were dealing with. So I want to jump to Howard Taft. Howard Taft is elected in 1908 and suddenly recognizes changing realities for the British Empire, for the American Empire, and he has great ambitions. He's building on the inheritance he received from Theodore Roosevelt, but it is much more sophisticated in many ways, a lot more subtle. Theodore Roosevelt did not have a particular affection for Canada, but Taft did. There was a fear in the Taft administration, or let's say a recognition, that Britain and Canada was creating what essentially amounted to a trading bloc. Britain and its colonies were forming a Zollverein, a trading bloc where preferential rates were reduced, where a free trade arrangement, it's not a free trade arrangement, but a consistent agreement to lower barriers to trade was being expanded. There was a great movement in Britain, stunted a little bit by the election of 1906, but all the same, there was a fear that Britain's impulse could be revived. The trade surplus the Americans had with the British had reached a peak in 1901, but had declined. We're talking about a trade surplus, but the trade surplus by 1910 had declined to 1880 levels. Howard Taft, the American administration, were quite concerned about that. They wanted more trade surpluses, not smaller trade surpluses. Canada extended a preferential rate to France. Now, what could be more offensive to Americans than to be bested by France? Canada had negotiated basically what amounted to a most favored nation agreement with France, and the U.S. was a bit offended by that. Why could we not have a deal with Canada that would be at least the equivalent of Canada's agreement with France? Pulp duties are a factor. This is the great age of newspapers, of yellow journalism. The American appetite for pulp is enormous. Ontario had established duties. The province of Ontario had established a tax on the exportation of pulp in 1903. Quebec did it in 1910, and Quebec produced enormous amounts of pulp. Again, Taft is aware of that because he summers in northern Quebec, is well aware of that. Then you have particular factors in terms of the American economy. You have an economic slowdown in the United States in 1910. You have a panic, a financial panic that year also, and then not least, you have a Democratic majority elected to Congress just like 2 days ago. Republican Howard Taft is not pleased by that. He needs to do something. He needs to revitalize the American economy, and that's one of the reasons why he approaches Canada. Not last, the dollar diplomacy of the Taft administration, a vastly global ambition to establish the American presence in Latin America, in parts of Africa, through the dollar, working with the private sector, opening doors for the private sector in the United States, the mighty financial sector in the United States, to extend loans to developing countries, to Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, to extend the influence of the American state. So the impact of Taft in all this is well worth understanding. Then look at Canada. As he looks across the border, Howard Taft realizes that we're doing pretty well. We're doing pretty well. And so is Laurier, noticing that. Look at the exports to the British Empire in 1895. So I'm using 1895 because that's the year before Laurier comes into power. Our exports to the British Empire, a little over almost $67 million. By 1911, $149 million, a growth of 123%, very respectable. But look at the exports to the USA, dramatically higher. And I mean, it rivals, the point here is not the nominal figure, it's the actual increase. It's the dynamism of the trade relations with the United States. You see a massive improvement, a 201% improvement in 15 years. I've also included the exports to foreign countries. Again, that includes the United States, but you see that the momentum is there at 221% when you include Western Europe. And we talk in Germany, France, Belgium, essentially in that. We're not counting Britain. And China. China also emerges, interestingly enough, as an important partner for Canada at that point. And again, the point here is the momentum. That's where the momentum is. Taft is not acting alone. And the role of the two secretaries of state under Theodore Roosevelt and then under Taft are important to underline. Elihu Root joined the Roosevelt administration in 1905 with great ambitions. He wanted to clean up the Secretariat of State, the department. He also wanted to clean the slate in terms of the relationships with Canada and worked very hard at that. These were sour moments. Canada was not happy with the way the agreement had been done on the Alaska Panhandle. Laurier resented that a little bit. And Root wanted to fix that, wanted to improve the relationship between Canada and the United States, and worked at it very hard. Root is a phenomenal Secretary of State, by the way, will get involved in all sorts of international controversies and will help resolve many of those. He'll win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912. But he set to work with Canada to try to create a stronger agreement on the boundary waters, the Great Lakes. This took a while. It took quite a few years of negotiation, of back and forth, but we did sign with the United States a Boundary Waters Treaty and created the International Joint High Commission. The point here is to institutionalize a method of resolving conflicts between Canada and the United States. Root will resign in 1909. He's replaced by Philander Knox, a banker from Pennsylvania, who also wanted to improve relationships with Canada. And we see a number of issues where Knox will help facilitate conflicts. The Uss Nashville Controversy, basically this is a ship that was allowed into the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence, an unarmed ship. The problem is that it docked in Chicago and then it was armed. It was meant to be a training ship. Well, the Americans, it turns out, always had the intention of arming that ship. But that was contrary to the agreements that had been signed between Canada and the United States after the War of 1812. And Laurier took exception to it. He raised the issue, and the Americans stepped down. The Americans decided not to arm the USS Nashville, and that issue was resolved. Of course, we're always talking about fish when it comes to Canada and the United States. There was a willingness to refer the North Atlantic fisheries issue to the International Court at The Hague. This was, again, a sign that the Americans were willing to listen to a third party in helping to resolve the issue between Canada and the United States. And then not least, the Bering Strait issue. Canada had been negotiating with the United States, with Russia on basically the sealskin hunt, pelagic hunt. And again, the United States offered to help and achieved some sort of a measured agreement between Canada and the United States. This is an important context. This is an important context, a rapprochement between Canada and the United States. In 1910, in the winter of 1910, Howard Taft took the initiative, working through Ambassador Bryce. This was the British ambassador in Washington. Initiated a conversation about the possibility of a reciprocity with Canada. Bryce eventually withdrew. Canada assumed the negotiation, and that's important. Canada assumed the negotiation. It was discussed over the summer of 1910. Eventually, William Fielding, again the Minister of Finance, traveled to Washington. There were more exchanges of models, and a deal was struck between Canada and the United States in the fall of 1910. Basically, the deal is a few pages. Okay, it's just a few pages. What was important was the schedule. You can see there's four schedules. The first schedule was free trade, long free trade on natural products, mostly food. Schedule B, a long list of quasi and manufactured, everything from fish packed in oil to urinals. That's specific. Urinals were an important aspect at that time, and they had to be included. Schedule C and Schedule D listed what products would be eligible for lower rates. That was the essence of the deal, and it passed. It passed in the United States. It passed both houses of Congress. Again, I emphasize, this was a deal negotiated by Canadians, not the British, and it would be passed by Canadians and not the British. It passed in the United States, but it did not pass in Canada. Now, David Mckenzie and I wrote a book published 7 years ago on the election campaign that emerged out of this deal. To make a long story short, it was opposed by the manufacturers, the manufacturing sector in Canada, led by people like Joseph Flavel. They were known as the Toronto 18. Joseph Flavel, he of Flavel House, just down the street, famous pork packer. The business sector in Canada opposed the deal. They were afraid that the free trade agreement with the United States would undermine their ability to compete and ultimately defeat their own business enterprises. And they campaigned hard against Laurier. They were liberals for the most part and worked against their chief. There's also another issue, and that can't not be dismissed as unimportant. There was a massive issue in French Canada, in Quebec, about the Laurier creation of a navy, a Canadian navy. This was considered to be outrageous in English Canada. The idea that Canada would have its own navy, its own independent navy, that could be, of course, lent to Britain should there be a war with Germany, because in 1911, people fully expected that that the British Empire would be at war with Britain, and that it necessarily would entail the participation of Canada. Of course, that happened. The Conservatives won big, a gain of 47 seats. Liberals lost, roughly the equivalent, but you'll notice that the popular vote was very, very, very tight. And we spent a lot of time in our book discussing where the votes were won and where the votes were lost. And you can see on the map of the 1911 election where people supported Wilfrid Laurier. They supported Wilfrid Laurier's tariff policy in the West. They supported Wilfrid Laurier's policies, tariff policies, and naval policy in Quebec and in the Maritimes. Robert Borden, of course, being a maritimer, sitting in Halifax, barely just tied the Liberals in his own home province. The deal, therefore, was defeated. Sorry about that typo. Was the 1911 agreement a good deal? This is a subject that is not discussed sufficiently, in my view. I think it was a good deal. Obviously, Canadians did not think it was a good deal, but one can speculate, and it's always a lot of fun. What if Canada had agreed to the 1911 election? Would prosperity have happened faster? Perhaps, perhaps not. But there are 5 important lessons here about the opportunities that open, those windows of opportunities that open between countries. Why did it work? Why did we go so far? Number 1, Canada negotiated from a position of strength. We were not the askers. The Americans asked, and that gave Canada, obviously, some measure of strength in terms of negotiating its policies. Canada played its cards very well. The deal was well negotiated. It was negotiated in good faith, without pressure. What scuttled it was Laurier. Laurier, in his arrogance and also in his democratic impulse. He did not have to go to an election in 1911. He was only 3 years into his mandate. There is nothing to say that the government of Canada has to go to the people in order to negotiate a deal. There's nothing written. It's not a written rule. He could have invoked closure. He did not, because he was a strong Democrat. He felt as though he needed to have that mandate. That's the best side of him. It's also arrogant. He thought he could win. He thought he had a winner. He thought he could thump Borden once again, and he relished the fight. Big, big mistake. Third thing to remember out of this is that American offers are rare. As I said at the outset, that's the only time we ever had one. It's the only time we ever had a formal offer to negotiate and a formal signature on an agreement. Why? Because it was a particular moment in the American history, in the American government awareness. There was a great awareness of the potential growth in terms of trade in the world, trade in Canada. And there was also a concern about being excluded. Taft, Philander Knox, very concerned about being cut out of a trading bloc that involved Britain, cut out of a trading bloc that might involve France and its colonial holdings, a whole variety of aspects that the Americans simply could not resist. They had to be part of the deal, and Canada was a convenient way to get started. Last but not least, there was a presidential commitment. Exceptional. You don't see that. You just don't see that. And Howard Taft did provide that essential ingredient that made the deal essential. I would say that without those 5 conditions, it's going to be very difficult for Canada to negotiate a deal that will be purely advantageous to it. We live, to quote the old saw, as a mouse next to the elephant. We're lucky to have a deal if the Americans offer one. Our margin of negotiation is minimal. Thank you very much.